not a crusader, Gray often said, by which he meant that he never saw himself as someone whose primary vocation is to call God's people to account for their failure to live up to God's demands for justice and righteousness. The vocation of a Christian minister is sometimes described as comparing three biblical roles: priest, prophet, and pastor. The priest is one who serves God and God's people by administering God's rites and rituals. The prophet is something of the crusader. The prophet reminds God's people, often forcefully, that by claiming to be God's people, they have agreed to abide by the terms of a covenant they have made with God. They have agreed to attempt to imitate God's compassion and loving kindness, as well as God's justice and righteousness. Finally, the pastor, the term most familiar to most Christians, is the one who cares for his sheep, the shepherd. But as any number of preachers and writers have noted, in real life, sheep are dirty, timid, stupid, stubborn, with any number of bad habits. So although our image of the shepherd is often, in the poetic sense, pastoral, romanticized, the good shepherd not only comforts the sheep, but out of caring for them, herds the sheep in the interest of their well-being. It was as pastor that Gray excelled, whether as rector in a parish or bishop in a diocese. It was as pastor that many people loved him, even when he was speaking in a prophetic voice to them. He loved them, and they knew it, even as he chastised them. After all, he always genuinely included himself among those who need to be chastised, the sinners. Imitating God is extremely difficult work. The Christian theological term that encompasses Gray's ministry is kairos, the Greek word meaning time, but specifically the time chosen by God in which God acts in a particular place and person. When the New Testament says that God sent his Son in the fullness of time, it is speaking of kairos. Gray would have been an excellent pastor in any time or place, but from a Christian theological perspective, he was an excellent pastor in racist Mississippi in the latter part of the 20th century as a result of God's kairos. Because he was primarily a loving pastor, and because he was one of them, he could speak prophetic words to his congregations, to his communities, and even to the elected officials, such as a racist governor. The fact that he had Christian love for all these people didn't mean that they would like the words he spoke or even that they would heed them, but it did mean that he could say them in a way that many others could not. Because he was a loving pastor, he could also be elected bishop by the clergy and laity of the Diocese of Mississippi, only a few years after many had reviled him for his stand on racial justice and reconciliation. Gray's election as bishop in 1974 was also evidence of how much white Mississippi had changed in 20 years. And Gray himself was a significant part of that change. As a correspondent had written him when he wrote him back in 1991, after Gray was elected Chancellor of Sewanee, no small part of Gray's everyday sainthood was that he stayed in Mississippi and that he worked for change. That's certainly one of the things he would want you to do, because he talks about this started out, he was like, well, I said somebody needs to write your biography. He said, I always thought when I retired I'd write my memoirs. Well, it was clear to me that wasn't going to happen, because if somebody needed him to do something, he was going to do that. He wasn't going to sit down writing about himself day after day. So, but he said earlier this week, he said, if I were going to write a book about the people in my life, I would write about people you never heard of, who, he said, supported me in when I'm taking these stands, a couple of his senior wardens, for example, and of course his wife. Somebody else said to me, you should have written this book about Ruthie Gray, but there's no way she would have let me do that. It was going to be about him. So, yeah. But that's the lesson he'd want you to take, really. Everyday saints.